Hello and welcome to the Business English Podcast. I'm Rob and I'm thrilled you're tuning in today. Now, we're going to dive into a crucial topic for anyone working in a multicultural environment: how to adapt your tone and style for colleagues and clients from different cultures. But before we jump in, let me tell you a quick story about our protagonist, Charlie. Charlie is a non-native English professional who has just landed a fantastic opportunity in London. On his first day, he walks into a conference room buzzing with diverse voices. A colleague from Japan, another from Germany, someone else from Brazil, and of course, a few Brits sprinkled in there too. Everyone's sharing ideas at lightning speed. Charlie has brilliant insights to contribute, but as ever, he pauses. Should he speak up immediately like some team members are doing, or wait politely as others seem to prefer? How direct should he be in voicing disagreements? Even though Charlie's English is strong, he finds himself grappling with how to match the communication styles around him. He worries about appearing rude, or worse, not being taken seriously if he stays too quiet. Now, does this sound familiar? Maybe you've been in a situation where you're uncertain whether to be bold and straightforward, or more subtle and indirect. Or perhaps you've noticed misunderstandings simply because your listener comes from a culture where context, politeness, or hierarchy carry more weight than a quick, firm statement. In this episode, I'll walk you through precisely how to handle these nuances. You'll discover why it matters to tune into both high context and low context communication styles. Plus, practical phrases you can use right away, as always. We'll also talk about common pitfalls, what to avoid if you want to establish real trust in a global setting. And stay with me until the end, as I'll be sharing one simple technique that can instantly bridge cultural gaps in any team meeting, or of course, a client's presentation. Ready to become more culturally intelligent and elevate your global communication skills? Well, let's get started. Now, let's talk about why this skill, adapting your tone for different cultural contexts, really matters. Imagine you're leading a project with a team scattered across multiple time zones. Some colleagues prefer short, direct emails outlining tasks. Others, on the other hand, might expect a more relational approach, with a polite greeting and a personal note before discussing business. If you miss these subtle differences, you risk coming across as either too blunt or too vague. And yes, those small slips can break trust or slow down collaboration. At the heart of this, there are two major communication styles. High context cultures, think Japan, many parts of the Middle East, or Latin America, tend to rely heavily on non-verbal cues, shared background, and polite, indirect phrasing. Low-context cultures like the United States, Germany, or Australia usually lean on direct, explicit statements to get their point across. When you know how to navigate these nuances, you'll not only avoid awkward misunderstandings, but also show respect for each person's way of communicating. Why is that such a big deal in business, you may ask? Well, for starters, people feel heard and valued when you meet them where they are, especially in negotiations, team meetings, or even casual chats after work. And trust me, that sense of being understood goes a long way in building strong professional relationships. That's how deals get closed faster, feedback flows more freely, and teams operate more smoothly. Now, allow me to give you a couple of quick examples. Say you're pitching a new product to a company in a high-context culture. Starting with a warm greeting and a bit of a social rapport can set a positive tone before delving into business. On the other hand, if you're emailing a contact in a low context culture, jumping straight into the key points in a concise way is often appreciated. In other words, your approach shifts depending on who's on the receiving end. And yes, that might sound tricky, but with a few adaptable phrases, it's simpler than you think. So, coming up in the next section, I'll break down exactly how to shape your words and tone. And there's one particular phrase I'll share that can instantly diffuse tension, no matter where your colleagues are from. So stay tuned and let's keep moving. Now that we understand why it's so important to adapt your tone and style across cultures, let's dive into the how. Just before we jump into some practical phrases, a quick reminder. If you'd like more powerful professional resources, plus a full transcript of an episode, sign up for our weekly newsletter called the 3-Minute Minutes. It's packed with concise, high-impact tips to sharpen your communication skills. You'll find the sign-up link in the show notes. Now, let's start with 2 phrases that showcase how we can adapt our language based on high context versus low context communication styles. Phrase 1. High context. I appreciate your insights. Could we explore another perspective? I appreciate your insights. Could we explore another perspective? This phrase works perfectly in a meeting where people may be more indirect in voicing feedback. Notice the structure. You start by acknowledging the other person's ideas. I appreciate your insights, before suggesting an alternative. That balance between politeness and subtlety is especially appreciated in high context cultures like Japan or certain parts of Latin America. You're signaling respect and gently guiding the conversation to new territory. Phrase 2. Low context. Let's clarify the main objective. Are we aligned on the next steps? Let's clarify the main objective. Are we aligned on the next steps? This phrase is succinct, which is ideal when dealing with low context teams in places like the US or Germany, where directness is highly valued. Grammatically, you're using the inclusive let's to show shared responsibility, and the question, are we aligned on the next steps, ensures everyone is on the same page before moving forward. Now, beyond these 2 examples, here are some polite openers that help you gauge the communication style of the person you're speaking to. I consider these very important as it really does help you tell what style of communication your audience prefers. So, repeat them after me. May I ask? May I ask? Number 2. Would you mind if? Would you mind if? Number 3. Could you please? Could you please? These are short phrases, but with a big impact. These openers are universally polite, yet the level of directness is flexible depending on what follows. You can soften your request for high context listeners or jump straight to specifics for a low context audience. Now I want to touch on bridging cultural gaps, which for those of us working in the international business arena is very important. So sometimes you're not sure if you've been understood correctly or if you're stepping on anyone's toes. That's where phrases like, just to confirm, do you mean, and we appreciate all perspectives here, really shine. The first one checks you're interpreting someone's comment or feedback accurately, especially important in high context situations where a lot goes unsaid. The second phrase fosters a collaborative atmosphere, reminding everyone in the room that every viewpoint is valuable. Both are surefire ways to build trust across cultural boundaries. Now, we're going to take these phrases even deeper in the next segment, talking about common mistakes people make and how to apply these expressions seamlessly without coming across as scripted or unnatural. Stay tuned because there's one adjustment you can make to any sentence that instantly boosts your cultural intelligence. More on that in just a minute. Alright, let's tackle some of the most common pitfalls when navigating communication across different cultures. And I promise, if you can avoid these, you'll build rapport and trust a whole lot faster. First off is being overly direct. Sometimes, especially if you come from a low context background, you might think you're just being clear. But in many high context environments, your directness can come across as blunt or even insensitive. If you've ever received a frosty response to a perfectly logical request, that might be why. And yet, on the other side of the spectrum is being too vague. This happens when you're worried about offending someone and end up burying your main point under layers of politeness. Listeners from low-context cultures might find this confusing, thinking, wait, what's the actual point here? Or they might assume you're just being non-committal. Another major mistake is failing to read non-verbal cues. Things like tone, body language, or facial expressions that can speak volumes in high-context cultures. If you're missing these hints, you might overlook cues that your colleague disagrees or that they're waiting for an invitation to speak. So the million-dollar question here is, how do you strike the right balance? Tip number 1, observe and listen. Notice how your counterparts phrase feedback. Do they often use polite openers like, could we possibly, or would you mind if? That's your cue to mirror their style, just enough to show you respect the cultural norm. Tip number 2, ask for clarification. In tense or uncertain moments, try just to confirm. Do you mean? Or am I correct in understanding? It's the best way to avoid guesswork and show genuine interest in understanding the other person. Tip number 3, practice polite disagreement. You can introduce an alternative view without shutting others down. For instance, I see your point. However, could we consider an alternative approach? That softens any potential sting while still opening up the conversation. One of the coolest things about mastering this skill is that it's cumulative. Every time you apply these tips, you train yourself to be more culturally sensitive and more effective in global teams. Coming up, I'll wrap up with a quick recap and a surprising little mindset shift that makes it easier to hold on to these habits long term. So keep listening. That's a wrap for this episode of the Business English Podcast. We've covered a ton of ground on adapting your tone and style for a multicultural workforce. So give these approaches a try in your next meeting or email. Before we say goodbye, I want to leave you with one final tip. Always approach new communication styles with genuine curiosity. Instead of feeling anxious about getting it right, think of each interaction as an opportunity to learn something new about how people connect around the world. Curiosity is the gatekeeper to deeper cultural intelligence, and it keeps you open to feedback and observation. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to check out the show notes for extra resources and, of course, sign up for our newsletter, The 3-Minute Minutes, for even more practical tips to help you stay ahead of the competition. Thanks for listening. I'm Rob, and this has been the Business English Podcast. Stay curious, keep practicing, and of course, keep it strictly business.